Hello, everyone. I'm Helen McGrath, Executive Director of Policy and Governance at LLG, and I'm joined this week for our vlog by Dennis Hall, Bulletin Editor.
Hi, everyone.
Now, as you know, each week we'll pick a topic of interest from the local government news and take a closer, more in-depth look. And if you've got a particular interest in something that's happening, why not get in touch and join the discussion? Come and join us at the blog. So, Dennis, what will we look at today?
Well, Helen, with LLG's governance conference taking place in Sheffield on the 10th of November, it seems timely for us to focus on one of the main themes of the conference, standards and ethics, of course, but in the context of the recent news that Lord Jonathan Evans, chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, is stepping down after 5 years in office. Helen, I see, in fact, I was looking at the programme earlier, there are some sessions there on the Code of Conduct, guidance for statutory officers, and the future of monitoring officers. So, before we look at some aspects of this, shall I go through some of the points Lord Evans made in his final speech last week at the Institute for Government? Right. There is still a major problem on local government standards, so says the outgoing chair of the Committee on Standards in Public Life, Lord Jonathan Evans, speaking at the end of his 5-year term. In a valedictory speech at the Institute for Government last week, Lord Evans said we were disappointed that the government took 3 years to respond to the 2019 report entitled Local Government Ethical Standards. The government rejected the committee's recommendations, notwithstanding the widespread support in the sector, and the matter does need to be looked at again with a pair of fresh eyes. So, clearly, Helen, Lord Evans feels that there is some unfinished business regarding standards in the local government sector. An interesting speech nonetheless, Helen.
Certainly, and I think I've got an incredible amount of respect for Lord Evans. I've never met him, but he certainly endured a period of time which presented quite a number of challenges. And I think, I think we would do well to remind ourselves that standards eroded during his period of tenure, which was not on him, but I think we all have to accept that that is the case. We had 2 independent advisors on minister standards step down.
You make the point that indeed his 5 years is quite remarkable, isn't it, as to what came across his desk. High-profile public clashes, of course, with Boris Johnson over that ministerial role. Remember, Lord Geidt was appointed and then resigned. Yeah. And then, of course, there was the Owen Paterson affair and the fallout from that. And, of course, as I mentioned earlier, yet more clashes with the Johnson government over its much delayed and disappointing response to the 2019 report on local government ethics.
Yeah, let's not forget the Home Secretary reports which found bullying that Boris Johnson chose to ignore as well.
Yes, I think there was that as well.
But taking us back to the reports, the 2019 reports, there were a number of recommendations made by Lord Evans and the committee within that report. To my knowledge, and I have to admit now we're 4 years on, the only recommendation of merit that the government seemed to agree with at that time when they responded 3 years later was the one around enhanced statutory protection for monitoring officers. They did see the sense in that,
yes,
but yet haven't moved to do anything about it.
Well, it was, but Lord Evans was committed to change in a fundamental sense, and in particular the introduction of robust sanctions for serious breaches of local codes of conduct. And I think it's important because it just so happens I have an extract from that 2019 report with me. Fundamental to him was this particular point, and if I can just highlight this one. In the report itself, Lord Evans said, the current sanctions available to local authorities are insufficient. Didn't mince any words there. The current lack of robust sanctions damages public confidence in the standards system and leaves local authorities with no means of enforcing lower level sanctions, nor of addressing serious or repeated misconduct. So the key issue to change things for him was to bring in some kind of strong power, which in this case was the power to impose suspension for up to 6 months. And the fact that that wasn't approved by government after a 3-year delay, for him, that was fundamental to his concerns. That was the change that he wanted to see. Without that change, there was no real change as far as he was concerned. And I think his strength of view was expressed, again, something I've pulled out from the records. Remember, there's this 3-year delay with the government. And in his response to the government, Lord Evans said in a letter to Sir Simon Clarke, who was then the Minister for Local Government, the committee is very disappointed that many of its careful recommendations have not been accepted. It was clear from our evidence that the sector backed our call to strengthen the arrangements in place to support high ethical standards. There is clear frustration within local authorities at the limited powers within local government standards within the regime to address poor behaviour by a minority of individuals. For him, this one change was fundamental to the overall issue of confidence in local government standards.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's continued to play out, and we know from the work and the research that we've been doing in relation to the report that's going to come out at the governance conference with the Local Government Information Unit and Brown Jacobson, that standards remain, lack of sanctions and the erosion of standards remains absolutely fundamental.
Yes, I think there's that issue. The other issues about abuse and intimidation are still high on the agenda for local government, for monitoring officers, for those concerned with upholding standards within local government. And I think Lord Evans said in his speech that he remains hopeful that a fresh pair of eyes will look at all of these issues, which he considers, as I say, unfinished business in our sector.
Quite. And I think central government has played a role in determining the behaviour of local government and the way in which local government conducts itself. But I think also that abuse and intimidation is something the LGA have been running a huge campaign on, because it very much does affect the representation, the people that are willing and able to come forward and stand as local councillors or feel safe to stand as local councillors, but also the question around how much influence that has upon their independent decision making. And I know in this speech, Lord Evans made some reference to Brexit decision making at the time of Brexit. So I think the impartiality is of great concern, the impact on decision making. I also think as well that there are concerns, and he spoke about them, around the powers of the executive and the independence of the judiciary. And also, I think it's important to highlight that he also talked about the issues around financial scrutiny within central government. I think he highlighted the point that there were more rules applicable to the charity sector than there are to electoral donations. And he was also concerned and gave a flag to foreign influence in relation to domestic politics.
Indeed. You've just demonstrated there the wide breadth of issues that he covered in relation to standards. I know we're naturally concerned about local government, but you've just mentioned there a whole raft of areas going right across the spectrum of every aspect where standards are important. And I've tried to understand his 5 years and tried to put it in context. And for him, the issue of standards was important because of its importance in relation to the impact on democracy generally. And we have to remember, when you try to put his tenure of office into perspective, that we need to recognise that Lord Evans held office during the most turbulent, the most difficult time in modern British politics, both nationally and locally, right across the board in all of those things you've just mentioned. And I think commentators generally agree that the post-Brexit period that you alluded to earlier is often characterised by dysfunction. It's characterised by less respect, less trust for politicians, less respect for constitutional and ethical norms. And we've seen lots of examples of that in his 5 years. And there's been more intolerance, more abuse, and more polarization in political debate. And these are the things looking ahead. And again, across all of those areas, these are the things that we need to address and have solutions to. You mentioned the judiciary. I can't remember any time in my career when there's been such criticism and it's an intolerance of the judiciary and of legal decision making in this country.
No. Well, what do we think will be next for local government standards and monitoring officers? I mean, I know we've talked about Lord Evans's hope for the future. Certainly, LLG will continue to campaign really assertively on this matter, and we're hoping to use some of the all of the recommendations from the report with the LGIU and Brown Jacobson in order to inform our campaigns moving forward, because I think it's based on empirical evidence for the first time all together in one place, and actually it links into the other strand of work that we'll be discussing at the weekend school governance conference in relation to governance failings more broadly in local authority, which is with Grant Thornton, Solid, Tipfer. So, you know, those two powerful pieces of work, we're really pinning our hopes on will make a massive change in the sector.
Yeah, well, I think there I think the conference program highlights something that I'm seeing as a bulletin editor and seeing all the news that comes in concerning our sector, and it reflects something of my own experience. I'm an independent person on a local authority standards committee. I speak to monitoring officers and governance lawyers, and I think a number of things are emerging that monitoring officers are faced with at the moment. The pressures upon monitoring officers are both enormous and diverse. Workloads are changing. The huge financial pressures are generating far greater amounts of work in the area of corporate governance, as you've described earlier. More maladministration cases are coming forward. And there's another area too where I see pressures coming in the field of social housing, and especially since the Awab Ishak case in Rochdale, both Duluth and the Housing Ombudsman are acting at pace, watching what's happening in our sector, regulating more closely what's happening with social housing. And the results of all, I don't think that standards will be the main part of the agenda for monitoring officers in the same way as in the past. I think the field of vision of monitoring officers is going to be more complex and will involve all of these other areas as well. The issue for monitoring officers and their teams is how to face all of these challenges. And that is not to say that standards is no longer as important as it was. It is. But as I say, monitoring officers look out upon a far more complex range of issues to deal with at this time.
They certainly do. Well, thank you for joining me today, Dennis. If anybody wants to hear more coverage of what's going on in the local government legal world, please do listen to the Grapevine podcast. And on that note, goodbye from me.
Bye from me too.